It is early morning in June. You walk out to the garden before the heat comes in. The cucumber vines have filled out the way you wanted. Dark green leaves. The first yellow flowers open sometime in the last 2 days. You have been watering on schedule. Fed them when the book said to feed them. Done everything the way you were supposed to. And then you see it. On one of the lower leaves, a thin dusting of white powder. You touch it. It comes off on your finger. You stand there and think back to last week. The rain. The humidity. You blame the wet weather. That is exactly what most gardeners think. And researchers at the University of Malaga spent years studying this disease, and what they found stopped them. This disease does not need rain. It does not need humidity. It thrives in dry air. The week your cucumbers looked the healthiest, that is often the week the damage began. And if you are about to reach for something to treat it today, there is one thing sitting in a lot of garden sheds right now that will make this significantly worse. If the temperature hits 90 degrees this afternoon, this video is not a list of products to buy. What this is about is the mechanism, because when you understand how this disease actually works, the solution is cheaper than anything on the garden center shelf. But getting the mechanism wrong right now, when the first cucumbers are just starting to set, costs you everything you have been building since April. Not because the disease is too severe to stop, because the wrong response at the wrong time exhausts the plant at the exact moment it needs every resource it has. Most gardeners follow the same logic. Fungal disease needs moisture. Keep the leaves dry. Wait for the wet weather to pass. That logic is correct for almost every other fungal disease in a vegetable garden. Powdery mildew does not follow those rules. It is an obligate biotroph, a parasite that carries its own biology in a way that makes it behave opposite to everything the standard advice was built around. If the problem were simply humidity, the solution would be straightforward. It is not. And that is what makes the most common prevention methods either useless or actively making things worse. To understand why, you need to look at what this particular spore carries with it from the moment it forms. So they stopped the overhead watering. They waited for the dry spell to pass, and the disease spread anyway. That pattern is not a failure of effort. It is a failure of information. What the research team at the University of Malaga documented in 2009, Perez Garcia and his colleagues, is that the spores of this fungus carry their own internal water supply. They do not need moisture from outside. They carry it with them. These spores germinate when the relative humidity drops below 50%, drier than the air inside your home when the AC is running in June, and water sitting freely on the leaf surface from heavy rain, from overhead irrigation, actually disrupts the spore's structure. It damages them. This is why the gardener who carefully keeps the leaves dry during a hot, dry week in June is not protecting the plant. That dry air is exactly what the spores were waiting for. The cycle works like this. Humid nights trigger spore formation. Dry, warm days release them into the air. Light wind carries them to new leaves. Dry conditions allow them to germinate without interruption. The week after your longest dry stretch, that is when you find the white powder, not after the rain. Morning watering does not contribute to this disease. What does need to change is something most gardeners get wrong. The moment the first flowers open, and that leads to something most gardeners never connect. Because the thing most likely opening the door for this disease right now is not the weather. It is in the bag of fertilizer you used when the first flowers appeared. You fed them on schedule. The vines were dark green, the stems were thick. The plant looked exactly the way every video told you it should look. Nitrogen does that. And for most of the season, that is exactly what you want. But there is a transition point that most gardening content never addresses, where the same fertilizer that was helping the plant begins doing something else entirely. The window is the first flower. The moment that first flower opens, the plant shifts its priority entirely. It is no longer building. It is producing. And nitrogen at elevated levels during fruit production does two things to the cell walls of the leaf surface. It reduces cellulose production. It reduces lignin production. Thinner walls. Less structural resistance. At the same time, elevated nitrogen increases free amino acids in the outer layer of the leaf tissue. For a powdery mildew spore, the one that carries its own water, the one already sitting on the leaf in dry conditions, those amino acids are exactly the nutrient source it needs. to drive its penetration filament through the wall. The plant looks healthy from the outside, but at the cellular level, the wall is getting thinner every day. Menzies and his team at the University of British Columbia, working alongside Agriculture Canada in 1992, documented that elevated nitrogen increased disease susceptibility, specifically in plants that were setting fruit. Same compound, same dosage. Opposite outcomes, entirely dependent on timing. Nitrogen is not the enemy. The plant still needs it. What changes at flowering is the ratio. The most common mistake is continuing the high nitrogen program because the plant still looks like it wants it. It looks like it wants it. The cell walls are telling a different story. Move to a balanced or phosphorus-forward fertilizer, the 10th of May 2010, or any formulation where nitrogen is the lowest of the three numbers, not zero. Lower. If the white powder is already visible, high nitrogen right now is not helping the plant fight the disease. It is making the walls thinner at exactly the moment they need to hold. Because the most common answer to what to reach for, the one with the organic label, the one on garden center shelves for 100 years, has a threshold that almost nobody warns you about. And if today's forecast shows 90 degrees, that threshold may already be a problem. Most gardeners reach for sulfur dust at this point. It is organic. It has been used for 100 years. It works. Until the temperature hits 90 degrees. And for a lot of you watching right now, today might already be too late to use it safely. Sulfur dust has been used for over 100 years. It kills powdery mildew spores on contact, and it has a temperature threshold that most product labels do not state clearly enough. Above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, sulfur does not simply stop working. It becomes phytotoxic. The same compound that was killing the fungus begins burning the plant tissue instead. Leaf edges start to scorch within hours, not days, hours. And if you applied neem oil or any mineral oil-based spray, within the last 14 days, that threshold drops to 85. Sulfur is a naturally occurring compound, but organic does not mean unconditional. The condition that changes everything is the temperature this afternoon. Sulfur remains one of the best tools for this disease. When the conditions are right, below 85 degrees, before 9 a.m., no oil treatments in the last 2 weeks. If you are in the Pacific Northwest, the upper Midwest, or at elevation, today may be within that range. If you are in Texas, Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, or Arizona, check the forecast before you open the bag. 2 options. Below 85 degrees, sulfur dust before 9 a.m., or sodium bicarbonate at 1 to 5 sute, documented at 60 to 84% control by the National Institute of Agricultural Science in Korea, 2021. No temperature threshold. Above 85 degrees, Bacillus subtilis sold as Serenade or Monterey Complete Disease Control, both at Home Depot, or canola oil with lecithin 70 to 97% control in the same study. No toxicity to bees. No temperature threshold. Cornell Cooperative Extension recommends rotating between 2 products with different modes of action. Alternating prevents the fungus from developing resistance, but knowing what to reach for is only half of it. The other half is knowing when the window opens and when it has already closed. The National Institute of Agricultural Science in Korea measured the economic action threshold for powdery mildew on cucumber, the point at which the disease causes measurable yield loss. The number was 17.6%. 17.6% does not look like a sick plant. It looks like one older leaf, lower on the vine, with a few small white patches, maybe 2 leaves. That is the window. Not when half the plant is white. Not when you can see it from across the yard. 1 or 2 leaves. Most gardeners see 1 or 2 leaves and think, it is early. Let me watch it for a few more days. By the time the disease is clearly visible across multiple parts of the plant, the threshold is already behind you. Yield loss has already started. That yield does not come back. Step 1. Once the first flowers open, scout the lower canopy once a week. 50 leaves. The oldest ones, the lowest ones, turn them over. Look at the undersides. Morning the light is better and the patches show clearly. Step 2. If you find white patches, act within 24 hours. Below 85 degrees, sulfur before 9 a.m., or sodium bicarbonate at 1 to 500. Above 85 degrees, Serenade, or canola oil with lecithin. Alternate between two products with different modes of action. That rotation prevents the fungus from adapting. Step 3. Every leaf you remove that shows white powder does not go into the compost pile. Penn State Extension is direct about this. Home compost piles do not reach temperatures high enough to kill powdery mildew spores. The spore overwinters in dead leaves. If those leaves go into the compost, and that compost goes back into the garden in spring, the spores come with it. Diseased leaves go into a sealed bag, or they get burned, not the compost. If the scouting habit is skipped through June and July, by August there is no window left. Walk back through what you now know. The white powder appeared after the dry week, not after the rain, because the spore carries its own water, and dry air is what it was designed to find. Most of your neighbors are still blaming last week's rain. The fertilizer you reached for when the first flowers opened, you now know what it was doing to the cell walls, thinning them, quietly, while the plant still looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. That was not a mistake you made. That was information that was never given to you. The sulfur in the shed, you now know exactly when it stops being a tool and becomes part of the problem. And the 1 or 2 white patches on those lower leaves this morning, you now know that is the window, not a warning to wait and see. The window. You did not fail your garden. Be August. The gardeners who understand this will still be picking cucumbers. The difference will not be which spray they used. It will be whether they understood what they were actually fighting and whether they acted when the window was still open. Tell me in the comments, what state are you gardening in right now? And when this video started, did you already have those first white patches on your lower leaves? Because the answer changes exactly what you should reach for in the next 24 hours. And I read every single one. Now here is what this video did not cover. Powdery mildew does not die when summer ends. It does not go into the soil. It survives in the dead leaves, the dry ones. The brown ones you are going to rake up and pile somewhere in October. And in spring, when your cucumber seedlings go into the ground, 5 feet from that pile, the spores are already there, in the leaves, waiting. What you do with those leaves at the end of this season determines whether this disease finds your garden again next June, from the same starting point, or starts from nothing. There is a specific 2-week window in fall. During that window, before the spores have formed their winter casing, while they are still exposed, one action eliminates the primary source of next year's infection completely. Most gardeners miss that window every year, not because they are careless, because nobody told them it existed. That video shows you exactly when the window opens, what the single action is, and why the gardeners who do this in October are the ones with clean plants the following June.